Here is some examples of goals. Ascend, which was Rob's company, their market penetration, they wanted 90% of the ISPs, 90% of the telecom companies, 2 out of 3 of the major telecommunication carriers, and 5 out of 7 of the Bell companies, which is a huge market penetration. What'd you say it was, 85% of the available market? When Rob and his team came up with this, he didn't tell you the story, but some of his people didn't believe this was doable. And I think, your whole marketing group quit, is that? But anyway, he became the marketing guy, so it went from 5 people to one Superman there. But it turns out these goals were low because I think he hit all 7 of the Bell operating companies, didn't you, instead of 5, and 3 out of 3 telecom carriers. So they had beat this. At VLSI, our market penetration goal was to get 100% of the game manufacturers, Ataris and Activisions, Mattel and Nintendo, which we did because we made such a great product. And we wanted to do 4 design tool installations, which were, we had this new concept in designing, and we wanted to get those tools in the company. And we beat that going away. We also wanted to develop chip on a board, which is some technology that didn't exist up to that point. I'm going to talk about VLSI because it's a good case study. Our core competency was memory design, high density, low power memories, and systems design through our design tools. Our value proposition was cutting cost to customers plus allowing them to generate more profit. The issues we had in the company, I said 2 years to fund it, but it almost took 3 years, which plays into this patience thing that Joe was talking about. We were the first semiconductor company funded in over 10 years. The venture capitalists didn't believe you could start another semiconductor company. So we had to educate a whole group of venture capitalists and investors on what we could do and why it was different and why nobody else could do what we were doing until we finally got funding. And we lacked top management experience. We were more operational people in there, marketing people, sales people, manufacturing, design. And when we got Hamburg and Quist as a venture capital investor, they allowed us to borrow one of their people as a temporary CEO. The positives of VLSI is we had a corporate sponsor in Evans and Sutherland Computer Corporation. They believed absolutely in what we were doing, and we proved to them what we could do. They introduced us to Hamburg and Quist, who funded us along with Kleiner Perkins. In those days were the 2 premier venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. We got a part-time CEO and a fellow named QT Wiles. We ultimately had a public offering. We got up and running in 1981, and we were public in '83. Some of the successes we had, we were the first one to use what they call fabless strategy or silicon foundries. We found that if we went on our business plan, we were going to run out of money before we get our manufacturing facility built. And we had orders from Mattel and from Nintendo and Activision. We had to deliver, so we had to figure out how to do that. Well, one of the fellows that worked with us had worked at Ricoh in the past and knew they had a wafer fabrication area. So we talked to them, and we did a technology transfer with them, and they provided the wafer fab business over in Japan. We also did the assembly and test in Korea, a company called Anam. And this first product actually went to Apple, so it got shipped from Korea to Singapore. So anything was done in the United States except the negotiations for the purchase order. And wafers were built in Japan, assembly test in Korea, and shipped to Singapore. Our first purchase order was $19 million with Mattel with a letter of credit. The products we had were read-only memories, microprocessors, custom chips, and a chip on a board. The first year sales for the company were $21 million. It was the fastest first year growth by a semiconductor company up to that point. We grew faster than Intel, AMD, any semiconductor company before that for the first year. But it wasn't the $19 million from Mattel. We probably only shipped $5 million to them that year. It was other companies that where we picked up business. So there's a lot of different things you can do to finance a company. Like I showed you how we did the letter of credit with Mattel and how Evans and Sutherland recommended venture people to us, how Convergent Technologies guaranteed equipment leases for AWI. One of the first companies I had, which was Synertech, all the investors in it were end users. We had Bulova Watch, a company called American Telecommunication, and Bendix, who wanted the products we were going to make. And they did equipment loan guarantees, facilities guarantees for the buildings we leased. So there was a lot of guarantees in there, so there wasn't a lot of cash that came into the company, but all of the capital expense was covered by our corporate investors. I have a couple of recommendations for you. Joe talked about this television program called Shark Tank, and if you get a chance, you ought to watch that program because it does tell you how investors think and how people present business plans to investors. So you'll see everything from well thought out business plans to pieces of junk. And you can see how they react, the venture people or the investors react to those. Even better one, I think, is something called Restaurant Impossible, which is on a food channel. And there's a fellow that goes in to failing restaurants and turns them around in a 2-day period. And they redo the whole facilities, they redo the business models, the menus and everything. It shows you how you can do a turnaround on a company that's already existing but failing. And it's reality. I mean, this is actually how people turn around companies. The other things I recommend is Smart Up, which is Rob's book. Another one is High Output Management by Andy Grove. Andy was the CEO of Intel. His book isn't so much in the technology business, it's just general thought process and how I manage people and projects and that kind of thing. There's another one called The Entrepreneur's Manual by a fellow named Richard White, which has a lot of great examples, marketing examples especially, that is worth reading. The theme I use in most companies is this one. You have dollar profit growth through the planned use of resources with controls and organization regulating the timetable. So you get the key points: growth, planning, controls, organization, and a timetable. And if you follow a model like that, it's a good way to run a business. That's pretty much it. And I'll entertain any questions you might have. Well, it's a two-way conversation. They have a need, they tell you what your need is, and you come back and say, well, we can do that, but we need specialized equipment, or we need to add more facilities or whatever. We don't have the resources to do it. Can you help us with that? And if they really need the product and know you can perform, you'll usually get them to respond and do that for you. Well, typically you won't get a classic investor to do that because it's somebody who needs what you have, which is a potential customer more than an investor. Investor might do it if they see the real opportunity, but if you probably do it through an investor, they're going to want some kickers in there. They're going to want some ownership in a company, some convertible preferred or stock or something besides doing. They have no other way to get their money back.
So I would say that's probably still there. It just depends, but it really depends still again on the business. If the business isn't there that can repay the lease, so they look through that. So but they're relatively conservative investors. They're investing based on the asset and based on the tax value of the asset.
And they want equity kickers usually too. They want a piece of your company. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
What about factoring companies as far as financing inventory? Like when you get a big order and you just don't have the money to buy inventory, does that work?
Well, that's one way to do it, but you give up an awful lot when you factor.
Is that right?
I mean, those people take big percentage of your receivables, And I wouldn't do it unless they absolutely had to raise cash. It's just not a preferred way of doing it.
Why don't you explain to the group, because I don't think everybody knows what factoring is all about. I think they need to know that a little bit.
If you sell a product to a customer or service and they haven't paid you, so you have receivables, accounts receivable, you can sell the accounts receivable to what they call a factoring company. And you may have $1 million worth of receivables. They'll give you $900,000 for that. When they collect $1 million, you know, they make that as their profit. And it's recourse, so which means that you could usually sell it to a factoring company, but if they don't get paid, they make you pay it. So there's a lot of risk there if you have a marginal customer. It's not the kind of business where you can do business with anybody, get receivables and sell it to a factoring organization, because you got a lot of risk involved in it. And it's usually only done in bigger companies, I think. I don't see it very much in small companies because they're not creditworthy enough to do this. I had a friend who was a Vietnam veteran, and he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, and as part of his rehab, he wrote a book about his experiences, which is a fairly popular book, and that's how I got to know him. His brother ended up, he was the world champion welterweight kickboxer, so it was an interesting group of people to know. But he wanted to start a surf shop in Santa Cruz. He made sandals, he had written a book, so he had an entrepreneurial bent, and he wanted a surf shop. And so I had an empty building there then, so I said, okay, we'll put you in that building. I'll help finance your surf shop. So he built sandals, sold his book out of there, shaped surfboards, and he was a traditional surf shop. He was just part of the problem with him, though, he was a surf bum. If the surf was up, he wanted to be out surfing instead of paying attention to the business. So there was a little conflict between he and I over how much attention you put into the business. But after we were in business about a year, there was another surf shop that came available, and it did used and consignment boards and gear, and it had tremendous margins. They were running like 85, 90% gross margins. And so we acquired that one to expand the business, and it was very successful for a while, but the fellow we brought in to run it didn't like the used equipment and consignment business. He wanted to change it into a traditional surf shop, so there was a lot of conflict between him and the fellow that I financed, and this whole partnership arrangement just sort of blew up because of what the fellow who did the consignment used surf shop business drove the margins down from like 85% down to about 25%. It became unprofitable, and that wasn't acceptable. So we couldn't change his mind, and that was sort of the end of it. It dissolved after that. Right, you need to be out there and be seen, and like Joe said earlier, you don't need fancy offices or anything, but they need to know who you are and what you do. And the what you do part's very intriguing too, because I've seen companies that have very funny names, and you read the name and you can't figure out what the heck they do. And I think it's pretty important that people know exactly what you do. If you don't have a name that portrays what you do, you're losing a lot in the marketplace. And you know, some of the, like Dell computer, at least it has computer in the name, but if it was Dell, you wouldn't know what the heck it was. So, you know, when you do your marketing, you really have to have your name out there, the contact information. People understand what exactly you're doing. I think all of you know that, so I'm not telling you anything new.